Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of our workshop on race and racism in science. The recording of the first session, in case you haven't seen it yet, is now on the workshop website, which I will post shortly, but you've probably already seen it. Today we have a wonderful second speaker, Professor Anne Morning from Sociology. I will properly introduce her in a moment. But before that, we'll have a couple of organizational remarks. So maybe Emily Balcetis can say a few words first.
Sure. This is, as you know, the second part of a four-part series that has invited people from many different departments. This is a real opportunity for us to come together to think about, discuss, and learn more about issues of racism in the sciences. So I am here first in the capacity of a faculty member who wants to learn. That's why I'm here. But I've also been asked by the organizing committee to serve in my capacity as a diversity and inclusion coordinator from the Department of Psychology to serve as a resource for people that are participating in this workshop series. I'm here to provide support for the whole community, but especially for those members of our community who identify as underrepresented. Of course, there's lots of advantages, like I said, of coming together as a community to share different perspectives and to explore these topics within different facets of science. But there can also be challenges too of bringing together such different people with different experiences and different backgrounds, especially in this week. I don't think there has been an easy week to address issues of racism in different facets of our society. And this week might be one of those weeks that are particularly challenging. So as we talk about these issues today, just know that if you are looking for a place to debrief, I will stay on this call with Wei Ji and others for another 30 minutes. If there's more that you'd like to explore or things that you'd like to share or things that you would like us as members of the organizing committee to be aware of, feel free to take advantage of that extra 30 minutes. Or just as the conversation is ongoing, if you'd like to send a private note to me to enter something into the conversation, I'm happy to do that on your behalf. Go ahead and use the chat function. Or as you mull over these thoughts in the days and weeks to come, feel free to send out an email to me and I can help facilitate those kinds of conversations that would be most useful for you or gather additional resources that might help in processing what we talk about today. So again, thank you to Wei Ji and all of the people that helped to make this possible. I'm really excited to learn from Anne Morning today.
And thank you so much, Emily. So in addition to the debrief that Emily mentioned, there's going to be a second opportunity for debriefing, which just got posted in the chat. That's organized by the Neuroscience Student Council, NeuroPale. And that one is specifically for trainees and will focus on the recommended readings. You can choose to go to either debrief. They will go on in parallel. As you may have noticed, if you were here last week, we changed from a webinar to a meeting format. That's by request from students, and that has the advantage that we can actually see each other. And I'm thankful for those of you who feel comfortable enough to actually have your videos on. But it has the disadvantage that we don't have a separate Q&A function. So if you have a question for the speaker, just preface that in the chat by capitalized question. That will make it easier for me to lift those out. And if you have general discussion, you can just use the chat as well. Last week, the chat was used extensively for additional resources. Those are fantastic, and we will post them afterwards on the website. So please do that again this time, and feel free to engage in further general discussion. So that being said, I'd like to introduce Professor Morning. She's an associate professor of sociology at NYU. She received her PhD in sociology from Princeton, but she was also trained in a whole bunch of other fields: economics, political science, and international affairs. Her research interests include race, demography, and the sociology of science, especially as they pertain to census classification worldwide and to individuals' concepts of difference. She is the author of a book, The Nature of Race, How Scientists Think and Teach About Human Difference, which will also be one of our further readings. And among her many accomplishments, I would like to highlight that she was a member of the US Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations from 2013 to 2019, and has consulted on racial statistics for the European Commission and the United Nations. So I cannot think of a better person to tell us about today's topic. The title of Professor Morning's talk is Science and Everyday Beliefs About Race. And go ahead.
Luigi, thank you so much. And thank you as well, Emily, for these introductions. And also thank you so much to all of you for being here. This is just wonderful to be at part of this conversation that got so terrifically kicked off by David Gresham last week. As Luigi said, I'm a sociologist. I focus on race and ethnicity. And I thought I would start off by talking a little bit about the two main areas of the sociology of race that I focus on, because both of them have links in different ways to things that people believe about science, or things that people believe that science tells us about race. So I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. There we go. Okay, you can see my screen, I take it?
Oh, good.
Great, my PowerPoint, fantastic. So there are basically two main areas that I focus on, and I want to tell you about them and a little bit about how I came to them as a segue into this topic of everyday beliefs about race that I'll focus on today. So one area that I focus on is racial classification, racial and ethnic categories, like the ones that we see, for example, on the United States Census. And these kinds of census questions in the US and elsewhere in the world are really an important and really informative window onto things that people believe about human difference in different parts of the world. Now, in the United States, what I often found is that people believe that these categories, like the ones on our census, are scientific categories. They imagine that there are a bunch of folks in white lab coats who have worked for years to produce these categories, and that when one answers a census question like this, one is producing some answer for which there's only one right answer. So all of us have a natural racial category in this thinking. Scientists know what it is. They've perfected this form to tell us what it is. And answering it should just be a straightforward matter of reporting this personal information. But what most people don't realize is that actually what these categories really are political and cultural categorizations and systems of thinking. I think you'll note in looking at these categories from the US Census, for example, how closely they track with the very old idea of human difference that comes to us from the 18th century, namely the kinds of categories that David Gresham talked to us about last week that thinkers like Linnaeus and others pioneered in the 18th century. So we see in our modern day US Census questions, we see the white, black, red, and yellow color taxonomy, basically, that Linnaeus developed. And what's more, to again bring these categories that David shared with us last week, when we are drawing on Linnaeus in our census, what we're actually doing is drawing on an even older system of belief. We could say a pre-scientific system of belief about human difference, which is the theory of the humors, right? The idea that human health and human personality are dictated by the balances of these four humors or liquids in our bodies. And we see all these ways in which Linnaeus incorporated that these humors that were associated with colors themselves, white phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and red blood, are colors that Linnaeus reproduces in his categories, and he also reproduces the humoral language of the phlegmatic and the sanguine and so forth. So there are very clear signs of the extent to which our contemporary categories of race are not quite the products of modern day scientific inquiry into human difference, but rather they are embedded, they have embedded in them very old ideas. What's more, we can also see in many ways their political and their cultural origins when we look at the ways in which these categories change so much. That is, they're not reflecting some stable reality of the human body. So for example, the US Census is famous for the extent to which its race categories change over time. They're constantly changing. If anything, it's the rule on the US Census that the racial categories change. Now, the US is also unusual in that we have had a race question on our census ever since the very first census in 1790. What I'm showing you here is just a snippet of a century of those categories and how they change from one census to the next. And I'll just point out two, interesting aspects that give us a sense of these changes over time. So we can see if we look in the 1890 column on the left, that at that time, the census included racial categories for mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon people. These are people with different degrees, it was thought, of mixed white and Black ancestry. And the US Census kept those kinds of categories right into the early 1900s. They did so at the request of scientists of the time, race scientists at the time, who felt that it was important to gather data about racially mixed people on the US Census so that they could prove that these people were sterile, that it was dangerous to allow races to mix. And they needed the data to be able to prove that. They turned to the US Census. And so these categories appear with that motive on our US Census. Another small detail I'll notice, 1930, we get a Mexican racial category. It's the only time, it was the first time, and it's been the only time since that the US category has included, the US Census has included a category for people that we now call Hispanic or Latino. It came about in response to the feeling that people from Mexico should not be considered white, that they should be put in a separate category as white. But the category disappeared as quickly as it came because the government of Mexico protested having Mexicans enumerated separate from whites. So again, we're seeing continually over time this flux in the ideas and the categorization of what the races are. And I'll just add very briefly, if we were to bring this up right to the present, we would see that the Census Bureau currently is considering or has been considering including for the first time categories or excluding Hispanic or Latino category and a category for people of Middle Eastern and North African descent. That was on the table before the 2020 census. The Trump administration took that off the table. I suspect it will be coming back. So my best guess is that we're going to see yet again an expansion of racial categories the next time we take the US Census in 2030. Now, in addition to these ways in which the categories change over time, they also change from place to place. And I wanted to touch on this because I know this came up in the session last week. Some questions came up about what do these categories look like outside the United States? Well, in a study that I conducted in 2008 of nations around the world using the United Nations census database, it turned out that to categorize your population by race is actually a pretty rare exercise for national governments around the world. And in fact, it's really only something that nations with a history of African slavery engage in transatlantic African slavery, I should say. So it comes out of a very particular set of historical circumstances, this impetus to classify people by race. We also get a sense of how much these categories change from place to place when we just look at our neighbors to the north and the south. Mexico at the time of the study didn't have a race question. It tried to get at people's indigeneity or at least their membership in indigenous language groups. And Canada has different categories than we do. They don't use the language of race. They have categories that we don't have, like South Asian, Latin American, Arab, West Asian, and so forth. So even with our closest neighbors, we're not on the same page about how best to categorize our populations. Finally, it's also really important to keep in mind that racial identities and categorizations also change over the course of individual lives. All of the people that I'm showing you here on the slide are people who have been in the public eye in one way or another because of decisions that they've made to change the ways in which they identified by race over time. And I feel like I should maybe give like a bonus or something to somebody at the end of this, if anybody can identify all four of these individuals. So we can talk about it more in the Q&A. But what I want to draw your attention to here is actually this research by demographers Karen Liebler and some colleagues at the US Census Bureau, who found that nearly 10 million Americans changed their racial identity from the 2000 census to the 2010 census. So in other words, all of these ways in which racial categories and racial identities change are cluing us into the fact that race is anything but a stable biological trait that we measure in some straightforward way. Clearly, there's something going on socially that is producing these racial categories and identities. So that takes me to the second area of research that I focus on, which is what I call racial conceptualization. And that was the topic of my first book, The Nature of Race, How Scientists Think and Teach About Human Difference. So let me say a word about what I mean by this term racial conceptualization. It's the expression that I'm using to try to get at a complex of beliefs that individuals hold about the nature of race. So in a sense, we could think of this as their working models for what race is. This includes their ideas about, how would you define race? How many races do you think there are in the world? What distinguishes one race from another? How do we know when to what race individuals belong, and why are there races? How do they emerge? How do they come to be? So that is really going to be the focus of my talk today. And I thought that to ease into it, I would say a bit about how I came to this. How, as a sociologist, how did I come basically to study scientists, and why was that interesting to me? Well, partly I got interested in what people believed about the nature of race because after studying census data, so you have large scale data sets telling you how people identify themselves by race, and you can look at all kinds of associations between those identifications and different variables, different characteristics that are measured on the US Census. But I ultimately was interested in what was behind that. That is, when people check off a racial box, what do they believe that they are conveying in terms of information about themselves? So I really needed to go beyond what I could gather from census data. But the other reason that I got interested in this topic about what people believe about race and what science says about it came from actually reading this book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. It's a book that I read as a graduate student at Princeton. And it ultimately led me to pose a question that I want to now lay out for you. But before I get to it, let me say a word about the author of this book, Ashley Montague. So Ashley Montague was a British-American physical anthropologist. I actually learned in the course of preparing for this talk that he taught at NYU for a while. I never knew this before. Apparently he taught here from 1931 to 1937, if I'm not mistaken. And Montague was part of a group of scholars who were deeply disturbed by the direction that they saw racial science, or the science of racial hygiene as it was understood at the time. They were deeply disturbed by the directions that they took under the Nazi regime in Germany. Now, we can leave aside for a moment the fact that, as David mentioned last week, what the Nazis were doing was, in a sense, elaborating on things they had picked up from Americans and British and other and Scandinavian researchers, but we can bracket that for now. But Ashley Montague and some other researchers really felt that they had a duty to try to combat the racism that was being implemented by the Nazi regime using their tools as scientists, that is, intervening in the way that they could to challenge the beliefs, the concepts of race that were underlying the Nazi regime. So he got involved in a lot of things. He wrote this book, and I'm going to say something about it in a minute, but he also did a lot of other things. He was most noted probably for having contributed to this series of statements on race that the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, started publishing in the early 1950s. So beginning at the start of the 1950s, Montague and other physical anthropologists and biologists and other scholars convened to issue this series of statements in which they try to challenge the common racial beliefs of their day. So they challenge that there's such things as superior and inferior races. They challenge the idea that it's dangerous for races to mix, and so forth and so on. But what really jumped out at me as a graduate student reading Montague's work was that he was making arguments about the lack of biological reality of race that I thought had only been made possible by very recent developments in human genetics. So, for example, I was a graduate student when Bill Clinton invited to the White House Craig Venter from Celera Genomics and Francis Collins from the National Human Genomic Research Institute to celebrate the sequencing of the human genome in 2000. And at that ceremony, they made statements like this. So Bill Clinton said, you know, I believe one of the great truths to emerge from this triumphant expedition is that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same. And Craig Venter follows that up by saying, you know, that this research demonstrates that the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. So what struck me so much was that I realized that those were arguments that basically Ashley Montague had been making more or less in the 1940s when he published the Man's Most Dangerous Myth in 1942. He was also making similar arguments about the fundamental genetic similarity of human beings, regardless of their racial classification. He was pointing out that there was no such thing as a race gene, something with some variant that pointed us to whether people were white or black or something else. That many of the arguments that were now being presented in 2000 as if they were the fruit of the most recent cutting edge research were actually understandings of human biological variation that had been around for quite a while. And so realizing that myself, just learning that for myself in the early 2000s, it got me thinking about, well, what had happened between Ashley Montague and, say, Craig Venter? That is, if we have known that race doesn't have the biological, the genetic basis that so many Americans believe it does, how is it that we've continued to hold on to these rather outmoded ideas of race for such a long time, for over half a century? In other words, what happened to the kinds of challenges to the biological race idea that had been floating around since the early 20th century? Why weren't they more widespread and more familiar to Americans? So that question is really what set me on the path of research that led to my dissertation. And really, that is what I'm going to be talking about today, how I took up this question of how concepts of race had changed or not changed over time in the 20th century US. So I'm going to share what I'd like to do with you in this talk today is share just very briefly, just kind of some key findings from that research. This was research that admittedly is now 20 years out of date. It's something I did in the early 2000s, and I would be interested myself to hear your thoughts about how some things may have changed or not since that time. But basically, what I'll talk to you is about research that I did in roughly 3 areas. So first of all, I analyzed a sample of 80 textbooks of biology at the high school level that had been published and used in the United States from 1952 to 2002. And I wanted to see what ideas of race were being conveyed over time in these textbooks to young people. Second, I conducted interviews with a sample of over 40 anthropologists and biologists at 4 US universities. I was interested in seeing what do these scientists say and teach about race today in the early 2000s. Third, I'm going to talk to you about what I found when I interviewed their students. That is, what happened when I talked to undergraduate students on their campuses about race, how they saw race, what were the ideas, the concepts they were caring about. And then what I'll try to do in my time remaining is to tie it together and link it to the kinds of work that we do as teachers and as researchers and the challenges that we face when we are working with race in those areas. Now, I realized that with a large group of people on the call, it's hard for this to be kind of a discussion. But what I'd like to do to allow some input and some back and forth is I've asked Weiji to allow me to hold basically 2 Q&A moments in this. So what I'll do now is I'm going to talk about what I found in textbooks. And after that, I will break, take some questions. So please, by all means, put your questions in the chat so Weiji can share them with me at that break point. Or if you like, you can also raise your hand and hopefully Weiji can see you. And we can have something of a brief Q&A at that point about what I've said to that point. And then I will move on and then have a final Q&A session at the end. Now, before I go into discussing the findings of what textbooks were saying about race, I want to introduce 2 key concepts of race that I'm going to be using again and again. I'm going to be using these expressions again and again. So I just want to define them with you before I go on. So one is what I would call the biological essentialist concept of race, that we could sum up in a sense as the idea or the belief that races are simply natural groupings of individuals who share certain inherited biological traits. So that way of thinking, and I should say, actually, I want to take my hat off to the many psychologists on this call, because their field has done wonderful work on essentialism and essentialist beliefs about difference. And so I'm giving here a very simplistic version of what is a much more sophisticated and really useful and thought-provoking literature. But to illustrate this kind of biological essentialist thinking about race, I've included a little strip from one of the textbooks that I analyzed. This is a textbook from the 1960s. And here what is presented to students is the idea that there are simply, there exist unquestionably these 9 races of human beings. It's presented as a matter of fact. That the idea that these races can be delineated or demarcated by their physical characteristics, their inherited biological characteristics. This would be a good example of a biologically essentialist message about race. And I'm going to be contrasting that concept with social constructivism or socially constructivist concepts of race, which in a sense tweak that essentialist biological definition of race as follows: that from a social constructivist point of view, what races are not natural groupings that we just find and discover in the world, but they're groupings that we make as human beings. I'm using here the antiquated and sexist term man-made, although it's factually probably pretty true, to get at that races are groupings that we human beings make. And we make these groupings not on the basis of simply some objective measurement of biological characteristics, but there's a lot of subjectivity that comes into these groupings. First of all, that subjectivity comes into those groupings because they have to do with ultimately our beliefs about what characteristics people are inheriting, in a sense, what essences different groups transmit to their descendants. And we also introduce this element of subjectivity because we privilege some biological characteristics over others. There's some things we pay attention to and other things we don't pay attention to. So for example, just to go back to my textbook illustration here, we can see that the grouping of these 3 main stocks of races are largely, not entirely, but they're largely based around ideas of skin color. Skin color is an important ingredient for grouping people into these different racial groups. Conversely, the groupers aren't paying a lot of attention to, let's say, height. So, if we were to decide that what we believe to be the average height of these different groups was a really important characteristic for sorting people into racial groups, we would come up with different racial groups than the ones here. So we make a choice about which characteristics to privilege when we come up with our racial categories. I also want to give another example to underscore the role that our beliefs about people inheriting different characteristics is important. And I'm going to use that by drawing on the tried and true example of former President Barack Obama, that everybody who teaches race probably uses Barack Obama at one point or another to illustrate something or another. And I'm going to use him here as an example of how we make decisions about where to group people that are often subjective ones. Now, in the United States, we believe that people who have any African ancestry inherit some kind of essence, some characteristics that make them indubitably Black. And so that social convention in the US, the one-drop rule, is what assigns us to what leads us to assign Barack Obama to the category Black. Now, of course, we all know that his mother was of European descent. And so logically, we might just as easily have assigned him to the group on the left of this screen. But here, this is where belief comes into play. The one-drop system in the US is a belief about the characteristics that people inherit from their parents and their ancestors. So with those 2 different kind of polar concepts of racial difference in mind, I want to now move into talking about what the textbooks do, what they conveyed to young people over the latter part of the 20th century when it came to race. Now, what I found was that we could say roughly there are three kinds of lesson, we could say, that textbooks convey to young people about race. One are what I call direct discussions. These are sort of like lessons in the book or chapters devoted to the races of man and arguments like that. And we'll see plenty of that. These kinds of direct discussions or lessons tended to aim to define race for the student, tell students what the characteristics of different races were, and account for the emergence of races. And we'll see examples of that. But there were also other parts of the textbooks where race figured in a more indirect, a more peripheral or less important way. And then finally, there were also areas in textbooks in which I would argue a message was being transmitted kind of subconsciously or implicitly without race ever being explicitly mentioned. And I'm actually just going to start off giving you an example of such an implicit message about race that I found in the textbooks. So I'm guessing that lots of you have seen these kinds of illustrations of evolution from pre-hominid and hominid forms to our contemporary Homo sapiens sapiens. And I'm guessing that, as I found in my study of textbooks, that this progression, these comparisons, were almost invariably structured around white men as being the endpoint, in a sense, of this evolutionary process, this progression. I have yet to see, and I'd be interested if anybody has seen or can share with me, I have yet to see the textbook where a Black man is represented as the endpoint of this series, or an Asian woman. I haven't seen it. Things may have changed since I was looking at textbooks. But I think that although race is never mentioned in these depictions, that they're nonetheless sending a message to students. First of all, they're suggesting to students again and again that white men are, in a sense, the universal human being, that they are the default or the natural or normal representative of humanity. The other thing I think that they're suggesting is that because there is this idea of a progression, even if it's not intended, I think it also suggests that, in a sense, that white manhood represents kind of the summit of where evolutionary history has taken us. So again, these are messages that the textbooks relayed again and again, but not in an explicit way. I want to turn now to instead what were the more direct kinds of lessons about race. And I'm sorry, I think that I realize some of the titles that I have here will be obscured, I think probably by some of the buttons for Zoom. But basically what we're looking at here is just a very basic bar chart of the percentage of textbooks that I found by decade that devoted space in their pages to what I'm calling direct discussions of race. So basically lessons about race was. And what I just want to note very quickly here is this very striking drop off where prior or sort of around mid-century, it was the norm. The vast majority of the textbooks that I saw were including lessons about race. They thought it was important to teach young people about the nature of race, but that drops off as we get into the era of civil rights and race becomes a sensitive and fraught political issue. It drops off further, but then seems to stage, at least in my sample, a little bit of a comeback towards the end of the century, and I'll talk about that as well. So what did these direct discussions of race, these lessons about race, look like in textbooks? Well, one aspect of them were definitions of race, and I show two examples here that are spaced 40 years apart, just to make one quick point, which is that in early textbooks, race was presented to students largely as a matter of surface somatic phenotypic difference. So, and we'll see other examples of a matter of skin color, so forth and so on. By the time we get to the end of the century, race is being defined to students as a matter of genetic difference that need not necessarily manifest itself in surface physical characteristics. So let's keep that, in a sense, that geneticization as opposed to the phenotypical presentation of race. Let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Another really important part of the ways in which this textbook we're talking about race is in the ways that they do what I call characterizing races. That is, they're spending a lot of time telling students about which races there are in the world, what they look like, what their physical characteristics are, and so forth. And I'm going to start here. I'm going to show you progression over time. I'm starting with these examples from the 1950s because they're very typical for that era. So what's typical about them, of that era? Well, for one thing, there were a lot of races then. You can see there were 10 races in this textbook on the left. Also, the races are positioned in a very clear hierarchy, right? They're not playing around. There's no mystery here about who's on top, right? Caucasians are on top. The Ethiopians, as they were called, are on the bottom. There's a lot of attention paid to aspects of various details of their kind of their surface visible characteristics. On the right side, the diagram on the right, the illustration on the right, it's kind of, we could almost think like a pop quiz where students are asked to identify to which stocks of man do these various groups belong. And again, the visual representation of this gives us a very clear idea of who is central, who is the norm, right? It's the white Western man in the middle with his fedora and his briefcase. He's the norm, and around him circulate all of these different people who are no doubt quite exotic for the American teenage readers of these textbooks in the 1950s, and are shown in physical settings from different parts of the world. So what's interesting, what changes over time? Well, quite a few things change over time. We go to the 1970s. There are fewer races now. There are fewer races. They're arranged in a different way as well. That we have in the 1970s a kind of visual arrangement where whites and blacks, who are central to the US national imagination in the era of the civil rights era, they're kind of central protagonists in the US imagination. They kind of share, we could say, equal billing in this sort of primary rung of races. What's important here too is that race is now brought home, it's now domestic. Race is no longer a matter of people in far-flung and ostensibly exotic corners of the world. Race, it's now understood, is something that characterizes the US population and US diversity and internal heterogeneity. So the woman who's representing, as it's called here, the Negroid race, is not depicted as someone in sub-Saharan Africa, but as an American with the dress of the era. So there's a simplification in a sense of race, a domestication of race. And when we move into the 1990s, we see a further, in a sense, streamlining of races. Now we only have 4 races, but what's interesting here is that none of these races are labeled. So actually, we don't know which races these are. I suspect that what we're seeing here in this diagram is the birth of a new Latina race. That is my guess of what the figure on the right is supposed to be representing. But the textbook, in a sense, sidesteps that, and that's representative of what is happening in these textbooks over time as they pull back from teaching about race and they couch race as a matter of genetic difference. In a sense, what happens is what the French sociologist of science, Bruno Latour, has called black boxing. So race, in a sense, by turning it into something that is a matter of genetic difference that can only be properly measured or known by scientists with the proper instruments and expertise, race, in a sense, and the basis of race becomes a much more obscure kind of taxonomy than it was in the past, when the idea was that anybody could tell what race a person belonged to by looking at the charts of their lip and skin color and hair color and all of those things. So in a sense, race becomes somewhat mystified in the textbooks. This in particular, this image I think is particularly mystifying because the caption says that tells us that these racial groups depicted here are only some, apparently, of all the races out there. So we don't even know how many races there are, what they're called, on what basis they've been delineated. It's kind of really a big mystery. Now, I mentioned there are also other ways, and I'll touch very briefly on these, that the textbooks talk about race. One is they want to give lessons also about the accounting for races, where races come from. Here's one from the 1980s that tell us that the races derive from different descendants of the Cro-Magnon. This was a way of delving into the race topic that actually staged something of a comeback in the later part of my sample, at least. And it comes back in large part to the textbook's embrace of what has been, kind of a languishing and not particularly scientifically embraced theory, and that is the idea of the multi-regional hypothesis. So to start with, what the textbooks largely are focusing on, or what they originally, what they're presenting as more of the scientific consensus view, that would be the recent African origin hypothesis, right? Where all human beings today, all Homo sapiens sapiens, descend from some original small group of human beings that originated in East Africa. But what's interesting is that the textbooks around the turn of the century start pairing that, I'll say, widespread or fairly consensus view of human evolutionary history with this other really older notion of the multi-regional hypothesis, which is, it's really a modern day version of the polygenism of the 19th century. And that holds that what races are actually are discrete groups that don't share common human ancestors. Instead, they are groups that descend from various pre-human ancestral groups that somehow miraculously all evolved separately into Homo sapiens sapiens in their different corners of the globe and at different times. And I don't think I need to probably spell out for you which groups they felt were only recent newcomers to full human status. So this really puzzled me. It really puzzled me why textbooks in 2002 would be embracing this old 19th century theory of race and racial origins. But I found a clue. This is just a conjecture on my part, but I found a clue in one of the textbooks. So on the right is an image that came from one of the textbooks, which reproduced this cartoon from the 19th century, which was illustrating the outrage that some people felt around Darwin's theories of evolution. And the outrage felt at the time that Darwin was suggesting some kind of kinship between man and monkey, so to speak. And the illustrator of this cartoon conveys that notion by putting this placard on this gorilla that is clearly, it's a play on, it's a satire of the anti-slavery movement's credo, am I not a man and a brother? So there's clearly a connection in the mind there between the hostility that Darwin met with over the idea that human beings might be related to other primates in some way, with the hostility that some felt around the idea of kinship among whites and blacks. And I suspect that what is happening with the textbook's embrace of multi-regional hypothesis is basically offering an out to students who are uncomfortable with the idea that we all share African origins. The multi-regional hypothesis theory tells us that it need not be so. The last aspect of the textbooks that I'll talk about is an indirect way in which they touch on race, and that has to do with their linking of race to genetic disorders. That has become, or that had become, almost universal in the textbooks that I studied at the turn of the century. It happens largely in these ways in which the focus is on teaching students something about rather well-known genetic disorders, where race is not the focus, but race gets, in a sense, brought in a rather indirect way, in this case, by associating different disorders with particular racial groups. And what this does is emphasize or reinforce an idea that is pretty widespread out in the American public, which is the idea that different races have different diseases. That there's a whole host of diseases that would only be found in one race or another, emphasizing that idea of these hard boundaries between racial groups. Now, different textbooks handle this differently. There are ways in which they can emphasize a kind of a racial reading of genetic disorders. For example, in the illustration on the top, where malaria and sickle cell anemia are linked only to Africa, as opposed to the illustration in another textbook on the bottom, which lets students know that malaria and these blood anemias are found outside Africa, in Middle East, Europe, and South Asia as well. So there are definitely choices that textbooks makers are making about ways to present their findings that either reinforce or counteract longstanding beliefs about race. So to sum this up, and then I'd like to break for any questions that people have, In studying textbooks, what I take away from it was, first of all, that textbooks that had once been devoted to teaching students about race really stepped away from that effort over the course of the 20th century. There are ways in which race continues to figure in the textbooks in the ways I've discussed, but overall, by the 2000s, the ways in which American biology textbooks were handling the topic of race was in ways that ultimately were reinforcing longstanding biologically essentialist notions of it. So I will stop there for a minute and see if there are any questions, Weiji, that.
Yeah. Yes, so there's one question already in. You can either type in the chat or raise your hand if you have a question. So the question is, can you please tell us how, as a sociologist of science, you define race?
Yeah, great question. So as a sociologist, you know, my research on both race in socio-historical perspective and what I learned from reading the work of natural scientists on it very much lead me to a socially constructivist view of race. That is, to define race as a system of classification of human beings, although not limited just to humans, but we'll stick with humans for now. A system of classifying humans that is made by human beings that we've invented, and that draws on beliefs about biological similarity, right? So it's an idea, it's a way of classifying people that is shaped by our subjective beliefs about the human body, really.
I had another a question myself, and then I'll get to the hand that I see up. So you mentioned that racial classification started disappearing from textbooks, but did students in return get any discussion of social constructivism in either biology or other textbooks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they really weren't getting it in biology textbooks. But I also looked at a much smaller sample of social science textbooks. And I hate to say as a social scientist, but social sciences weren't doing much better on this score. I have to say psychology books, not really bringing forth a constructivist notion of race. But even books in social sciences, geography, and geography in particular, tended to reinforce, as did political science, books tend to reinforce fairly essentialist notions of race.
Okay, yeah, there's several questions now. So I'll start with a question from Michelle Lee. How do you respond to someone who twists...
follow up on that? Sorry, does this hurt to ask the first question? I just wanted to clarify. So the social constructivist perspective that you presented earlier is not how you, as a sociologist of science, define race, right?
No, that is.
That is.
No, actually, that is.
Okay.
Yes, I just reworded it a bit differently, but yes. Yeah. Thank you for asking to clarify. Yeah.
So how do you respond to someone who twists the point about race and says, if race is a made-up social construct, why are we still talking about racial group differences, particularly in social political domains like education, health outcomes, wealth, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's really important to get across the idea that even if race is not anchored in some natural framework of biological difference that we just objectively measure, that is, even if race is not biological in its structure, that doesn't mean that it's not real. And that lots of groupings have a social reality to them that they don't rely on biology at all, right? If you think about religious groups, for example, right? Religious groups have an important impact on people's lives. They're important actors in society. People live and die for religion, but we don't think that they're only real if they have biological underpinnings. So that's how I would respond to that.
Next question is from Yelena Meretskaya. Wonderful talk so far. I've already learned a lot. Can you comment on the distinction between race and ethnicity and interaction or time given to the two concepts?
Sure. And you know what, I'm going to touch on this briefly because I'm hoping that by the end of my comments, I'll get to come back to this. But let me say very briefly that we tend to, in sociology, we tend to think about race as a system of classifying people that resides on these beliefs about their biological characteristics, whereas ethnicity is a system that tends to reside on beliefs about cultural characteristics. in both domains, it's ultimately subjective beliefs that come into play that are very important. But we tend to associate ethnicity with ideas of cultural difference as opposed to biological difference. And maybe, Weiji, maybe I'm just going to take one more question if it's okay, because I want to make sure to have time.
There is one more.
Oh, perfect.
From Michelle, have you seen any textbooks that address the structural, institutional, or hegemonic, I think that's how you say it,
yes,
factors and practices driving racial group differences in various socio-political domains?
Well, I would say that I wouldn't see that or expect to see that, or I have not seen that in biology textbooks. I would say that probably in anthropology textbooks, I have seen that kind of critique, but I think it's important to note that certainly at the high school level at which I was studying these textbooks, that whereas biology is widespread, everybody is getting some biology training, few people are getting training in anthropology or sociology, let's say, for example, or maybe even in political science or psychology. So what happens in the biology textbooks is really important because for many students, that is going to be the one chance at the high school level that they encounter some kind of discussion of race and what it is, because it's just less likely that they're going to get courses as high school students in anthropology, psychology, and so forth.
We'll get to the other questions at the end.
Fantastic, thank you. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and I'm going to now jump into what I found out when I spoke with university professors to get at how they thought about race and what they were teaching students. And just to be clear, this was a sample of, so I have the right side, there we go. Excuse me one second. Oh, okay. There we go. So this was my talking to a sample of over 40 professors, either of biology or anthropology. And the main takeaway here is that there was no consensus, that I found varying ideas about how best to understand race. I found both biologically essentialist and social constructivist notions of race. And it wasn't a matter of one discipline versus the other. It wasn't that the anthropologists all thought one thing and the biologists all thought another, but instead I found lots of variation within these two disciplinary categories. So very briefly, about 40% of the faculty that I interviewed with took a biologically essentialist position, that they understood races fundamentally as sort of naturally given biological groupings. They use this kind of language, breeding populations, haplotype groups with distinctive traits. They pointed to processes of evolution as having generated these biologically distinct racial groupings. But then a larger number of the ones that I interviewed instead saw race and explained it as a social phenomenon. And here I want to point to two different strands, in a sense, or two different kinds of arguments that the faculty brought to make this case. So one is the position that I call the anti-essentialist position, where faculty would draw on their knowledge of human biological variation to basically say that race was a myth in biological terms. As one person said, there's no biology attached to it. Another person points out the boundaries are just completely porous, completely movable. So biologically, race doesn't have any meaning. That's the essentialist point of view. And I contrast that with what I call the kind of the constructivist position, the kind of the proper or the core kind of social constructivist viewpoint, which is to make an argument based on socio-historical arguments, kind of like the ones I showed at the beginning of this talk about the variability in racial categories and so forth over time and from place to place. So some people made those kinds of arguments to counter the idea of race as biology. And I want to, I touch on this distinction, these two approaches, because I found something interesting when I looked at my, my sample. I found that not many faculty could really maneuver both of those arguments simultaneously. That most of the faculty who wanted to argue against a biologically essentialist notion of race either would do it taking an anti-essentialist sort of biologically grounded argument, or they would take a constructivist sort of socio-historical record kind of approach to it, and not so many people could do both. And I'm going to turn back to that later in my talk to talk about, I think, the consequences of that relative lack of overlap in those two arguments. But I do want to say a word very briefly about what happened when I interviewed students about their definitions of race. Because what I found that was among the students, and I should say that about a third of them were anthropology majors, another third of them were biology majors, and then a third of them were randomly drawn from whatever majors. That in this particular sample of students, that actually the modal way of talking about race, of defining it, was to equate it with culture and cultural difference, right? This was a way of talking about culture that their professors of anthropology and biology wouldn't use at all, but it was something that was popular among these students. So this idea that what race is, it just has to do with your culture and what you eat and what you wear and the language you speak and so forth and so on. And this was really striking to me because in a sense, it represented students trying to move race into the domain of ethnicity, kind of in the same way that we often use the word ethnicity because we think it's a more polite way to say race. What these students were effectively doing was saying, well, race, it's just a matter of like your voluntary personal choices of who you feel you are. You can just choose to be this, or you can choose to do that. You can eat this food or dress that way. And so race just becomes this matter of voluntary kind of signing up for racial membership. Now, to be sure, the students didn't actually believe this when I prodded them further on it. But I thought it was very telling that often their first pass at this question was to grasp for this language of race, which sort of put to the side all the uncomfortable questions about the historical imposition of racial categories, the violence behind them, and all of that. They kind of sidestepped that with their language of culture. Also striking to me was that an almost similar share of students overlapped that cultural definition to some extent with definitions of race as biological. So my percentages don't add up to 100 here because sometimes people would give me more than one kind of definition of race. And here, biological definitions of race were just about as popular as cultural ones. So here, as in this quote, race is just a matter of physiological differences that occur because of the environment. Finally, I want to note that even in this sample, which really oversampled anthropology majors, because anthropology is a small major in the US, and it was already at the time, even where anthropology majors are overrepresented, the idea of race as socially constructed is really a minority kind of view, or at least it was at that point. Rather few, even though anthropology in my study turned out to be the discipline that was most likely to transmit the idea of the socially constructivist notion of race in their teaching, still it was one that hadn't gotten a lot of traction among students. Now, there's one more way in which I ask students to talk about race that I want to share with you because I think it offers a very nice example of how lay people take scientific claims about human difference and fashion, we could almost say folk theories about it out of that. So one thing, this came out of a series of questions that I asked students where I asked them to explain for me, to kind of put their race notions into practice by explaining for me how they would account for certain racial differentials that we observe in American society. So for example, children associated with different races register different infant birth weights. But the question along those lines, the differential that most caught their attention and they were most excited to talk about and had a lot to say about, had to do with the field of sports. So I asked them about the overrepresentation and underrepresentation of different racial groups in this case, in the National Football League, with this question. And what I found out was that for the students in my American sample, and this was true also in research I've done in Italy since then, that the answer was clear, that Blacks are overrepresented in this sport and whites are underrepresented because Blacks have a major physical difference from whites. They're physically superior. And the language is often around muscle. So like this swimmer says, oh, and people that I know that are Black, they have this awesome muscle tone. And I have to say, between Italy and the United States, I think now I've heard every variation of the argument about the different muscles between Black and white people. So Blacks have more muscles, they have some different set of muscles that white people don't have. The muscles have different qualities. It's kind of it's always about the muscles when it comes to explaining a Black presence in sport. So I decided to see what happens when instead I ask them to explain white overrepresentation in sports. And I took the example of hockey. So, you know, do whites have special leg muscles that facilitate their skating on the ice, and that is why they are overrepresented in hockey? Well, no, that's not the case. With whites, their overrepresentation in sport is due to their cultural affinity. So the same outcome, in a sense, can be explained with reference to physical difference for Blacks and cultural, or as we'll see in a second, sort of the development of their mental faculties.
There's a quick clarification question, which is
yes,
when were the interviews with the faculty and the students conducted? Which years? Yeah.
They were these interviews were conducted in 2001 and 2002.
Thank you.
Now, I want to take a minute also to say that these questions then opened up a gateway to a really vivid imaginary that the students had of the human evolutionary past that I want to share with you, because I think it says a lot about how lay people cobble together notions of racial difference that they think are supported by science, that they think are scientific in nature, and that they're looking in some sense to science to validate. So I asked students to tell me why it was that they thought Blacks had developed this physical superiority vis-a-vis whites and frankly other groups. And they just went off on a tear, telling me all kinds of very vivid stories about how Blacks' African ancestors had to chase down lions on the savannah to wrestle them to the ground with their bare hands so that they could eat. So they had to be very fast and very strong, or alternately, they had to run away from the lions and cheetahs and so forth that were pursuing them. So of course, they had to develop these physical skills. So this is this very vivid picture of the human evolutionary past. Conversely, they felt, so I wondered, well, okay, so then perhaps when it comes to Europeans, we could imagine the scenario where the ancestors of whites, they kind of had to escape woolly mammoths on the ice during the ice ages, and they got good at skating, and that's how we get to hockey today. But no, what the students felt, both in the US and in Italy, where I've more recently conducted interviews, there the feeling is that Europeans had coped with the difficulties of their environment by developing their intellectual faculties. So Blacks had developed bronze and whites had developed brains over the course of this human evolutionary history. So I bring that up to, again, encourage you to explore with your students what are some of the ideas that they are bringing to the classroom when these kinds of topics come up, because there's clearly a colonial history, a history of slavery that feeds into these beliefs about white and Black bodies. And overall, and thinking about what this said altogether about what had happened to Montague's challenges to the biological race notion and why that didn't seem to really make much headway in the US today, what I concluded at that point is that, for one thing, there was still a lot of disagreement among scientists in different disciplines, scientists within disciplines. There was a lot of disagreement about how best to understand the nature of race. There was no consensus on a constructivist or an essentialist position. So what was happening that in the formal education, the formal science education that students were getting, at least as I gauged it through their high school biology instruction, was they really weren't getting constructivist message, and instead they were getting messages that tend to reinforce sort of old, long-standing beliefs about essential difference. And finally, what then did young people seem to have taken away from what they had learned about race to that point? Well, at least in the US, they were juggling these competing notions of biological and cultural difference, and they really weren't steeped in, they hadn't really grasped a constructivist notion of race. All right. So at this point, for the last part of my comments, and I hopefully can be brief in this last part, what I would like to do is now take what in a sense, what I gleaned from the study of textbooks and these discussions with scientists and with their students, and think about what it means for us as researchers and as teachers.
And maybe you have a glitch in your internet.
Then going on to challenges we face as researchers. So when it comes to teaching, I have become persuaded over the years of studying this that, oh, and I'm getting a message saying that my internet connection is unstable, but hopefully I will hold.
Yeah, it's okay now. I think you dropped out for 5 seconds, but it was okay.
Okay, all right. Fingers crossed that I will stick. So what I've come to suspect is that it's very important to combine both anti-essentialist arguments, that is biological arguments, as well as social scientific, socio-historical constructivist arguments, if we really want to get across Montague's notion, or what Venter said, if we really wanted to get young people rethinking everything that they think they know about racial difference. And I'll share with you two things that I do with my students to try to do this in the classroom as a social scientist who tries to bring biological understandings of difference to my students. So one thing I do is, first of all, try to introduce to them the idea of human biological variation as gradual or integrated in nature, as opposed to coming in discrete boxes. That is, it's clinal, it's not a matter of discrete jumps or differences. So I use the light spectrum or the rainbow to as an analogy of that, and to suggest to them, we have biological variation in my representation of here. That is, constructivism is not the claim that, oh, there's no differences between human beings and everybody is the same. That's not at all what constructivism is saying. What constructivism argues is that the boundaries that we put between groups are not clear-cut and obvious and natural, that we as human beings make decisions about where to put the boundaries in this sort of integrated spectrum of difference. But what I think it's important for them to understand is that when we do decide to put some kind of a boundary, to cut our light spectrum at some point that we have determined politically and socially and culturally, that once we do that, we actually create races that do have differences on average. So it's important, I want them to understand how we can measure, for example, average differences between the groups we call races, without that necessarily being the proof that our demarcation of those races is just some natural fact of the world. So I do that, showing them we can put a line in the middle and say there's a blue race and an orange race. We could instead decide there are 3 races, blue, green, and red race if we want. And we saw in the textbooks over time, a lot of this sort of going back and forth with the number of races there were out in the world. I also want them to understand how migration patterns enforce this illusion of there being discrete races, because when, as in the United States, we bring together populations from different and geographically distinct, or rather distant parts of the world, it's as if we're fishing from different and distant, disconnected areas of the light spectrum that reinforce the idea that these are very different groups. So what they have to understand is that while people of West African descent and Northern European descent and East Asian descent have been particularly numerous in the United States demography, and it lends this idea that there are, let's say, 3 races that are very important, that perception is being made possible by the fact that for so long, we were really not thinking about the groups that were intermediate to them. We were not reckoning with how we might racially categorize people from North Africa or the Middle East or South Asia or Latin America. And frankly, the fact that we do have a more diverse demographic, a more diverse demography today also is something that puts pressure on our traditional notions of race. It's important to, I think, to help them understand the arbitrariness of lines, because there's another way too that I want them to get used to thinking about race, and that is realizing that their conviction that they can just see race is actually not as straightforward as they think, by bringing to their attention precisely some of the groups that often, we could call them intermediary groups if we want, that often get left out of the traditional Linnaean red, white, yellow, black categories. Excuse me. So I show them this image and I ask them to tell me how many races are represented here. And of course, the answer is, it depends. There's no right answer. We can't just look at people and know naturally how many races we are looking at here. That if we were to look at some of the sort of earliest genetic genealogy tests, which tended to lump people of indigenous American descent in with people of Asian descent, these people would all be considered one race, all members of an Asian race or an Asian descent race. If instead we were going by the United States current classification, we would say there are two races here. The two women on the left would be part of the same Asian race. The two women on the right would be members of a single indigenous American race. If instead we went by Canada's categories, we would be looking here at three races. We would be looking at a South Asian race, we would be looking at a Japanese race, and we would be looking at an Aboriginal race, as they call it in Canada. So again, it's important, I think, to help students break the habit of thinking that we simply can tell a person's race by looking at them. We're used to doing it because we are used to testing ourselves with certain groups descended from very distinct parts of the world. But when we think about the full spectrum of the human race, it's more complex than that. Right, last thing, very quickly, and I do want to leave time for questions. I want to shift our thinking a bit more to how we interact with race as researchers and some of the challenges we face there. And I want to do it by sharing with you actually an email that I received from a graduate student in a doctoral program in Cambridge, a doctoral program in the biological sciences. I'm kind of hiding, I'm making this, I'm preserving confidentiality, and I'm not sharing the details of the message, but her message to me was simply this, that she was working in a lab that had done some research on a particular health outcome X, and she was uncomfortable with the ways in which her co-authors were writing about race in this paper. And so she quotes for me from their paper, that it mentions that the self-reported ethnicities for their UK-based cohort were white, and I made up these percentages, 70%, Black, British, African, or Caribbean, 20%, and other 10% reported various or unknown ethnicities, with a statement that ethnicity is a known indicator of X risk status, with Black women showing higher rates of X. So this raised a series of questions for the student, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it. That first, she asks, is Black as being referred to as an ethnicity? Does that make sense? She also asks, why are people of Caribbean, British, and African origin being grouped together in this category Black? What exactly is being captured? Is the idea that this is reflecting genetic similarity, some cultural similarity, or some similarities of socioeconomic status? She also shares that when she raised these questions with her advisor, he simply sent her to a web page, basically for the UK census, which, as we've seen previously, these censuses are political creations. And so she's wondering what help that is going to be in their biomedical study. And finally, she shares that she's concerned about what the negative implications might be of this kind of language and grouping, and especially of having taken a kind of off-the-shelf racial framework for categorizing people without actually exploring the extent to which this kind of taxonomy made sense. This dilemma is precisely what motivated a group of scholars in the biomedical sciences and in the social sciences to pen a letter to Science magazine last year, basically calling on the NIH to provide scientists with guidelines for how they should be using race as part of their research design, how they might be analyzing racial data, what place race should or should not have in biomedical research. And they urge the convening of a panel of scientists and scholars to address this question. So again, I would be very curious to know your thoughts about that. And I'm going to close, I promise this is my absolute last image. I want to stress at the end of the day that all of this whole topic of what people believe about race and what science contributes to those beliefs about race is important, not just for the conduct of science, but ultimately it's extremely important because of the ways in which these ideas about race then get carried out and implemented in the public sphere, in public policy, in governance, in our treatment of each other. And just to give you an example of one of the ways in which scientific research on difference, group, and individual has been interpreted in the political sphere comes from this snippet from the conservative commentator Andrew Sullivan. So Sullivan claims that one of our great problems today is how to reconcile the moral equality of human beings and the political equality of citizens with increasingly accurate scientific discoveries, he says, of aspects of human life that reflect our innate biological inequality. He says the problem is intractable, and the more we try and solve this problem, the worse it can get. The better we get at improving the educational or social environment or enlarging opportunity, the more tenacious and obvious our genetic differences will seem. He says this goes from individual to individual, but it also might apply to groups in certain categories. And I think we have a pretty clear idea of how this reasoning might be applied to racial groups. So I really want to close by thanking you for giving me the opportunity to be in conversation with you about this topic, about race and the ways in which science contributes to everyday people's understandings about race, because I think it has huge ramifications in our society, and because I think that it's imperative that we as social scientists and natural scientists work towards a clear and consistent message that we can convey to the public.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And this